Welcome back to statistics. In the last lecture, we covered similar topics. Okay, so first we discussed what statistics is good for and the ways this class can benefit you. We say that statistics will help you meet your degree requirements and graduate. Statistics will help you understand and carry out research for your major. Statistics will also help you get into graduate school and will help you succeed in graduate school. Statistics will help you and your family in your daily life so you understand important issues about health, mental health, and finances. Lastly, statistics will allow you to form intelligent opinions about important political issues. Next, we talked about how to succeed in this class. What is the most important single thing that will allow you to do well in this class? Think about it and do it. Then we explain what statistics are. Most of this class will be about descriptive statistics, which summarize information about a group of people. For instance, the average, proportions, and percentages all tell us something important about a group of people. This class focuses on statistics for the behavioral and health sciences. So the statistics we focus on in this class are about people. Statistics tells us about variables within a certain group or sample people. A variable is a characteristic that varies from one person to the next. For instance, height is a variable. Height varies from one person to the next. One person may be short, another person may be tall. Each person has their own value on the variable. For instance, on the variable height, we say that Marcy has a value of 5 feet 4 inches. On the variable gender, Marcy has a value of female. There are different types of variables. One type of variable is called categorical variables, which are also called nominal variables. These variables usually describe categories. For example, male or female, or maybe French, English, or American. Then there are continuous variables, which are also known as interval or dimensional variables. The values of our quantitative variables are numbers. Age is a quantitative variable. The values of age are numbers like 19 years old. The values of a quantitative variable are continuous. That is, if you have two values, you can always find a value between them. For example, if you have two values of age, which are 19 and 20, we can find a value between them like 19 and a half. A third type is discrete variables. The values of these variables are also numbers, but the numbers are always whole numbers, like 1, 2, or 3, with no fraction in between. Numbers of students in this class is a quantitative discrete variables. There may be 48 students in this class, or 49 or 50, but it makes no sense to say there are 49 and a half students. A fourth type of variable is ordinal. For ordinal variables, the values are orders or ranks, like first, second, or third. Finally, there are dichotomized variables, also known as binary variables. There are variables that have only two possible values, like alive or dead. Finally, in the last lecture, we showed you that how statistics can be used to understand the relationship of gender with survival when the Titanic sank. If you have any questions, please email your instructor to ask questions. Okay, so now we are ready for today's topic. We will begin with histograms. A histogram is a type of a graph. It looks like a bar graph, but actually it's different. A histogram shows how the scores on a variable are distributed in a graph. There are two kinds of histograms, frequency histograms and density histograms. I will be explaining both kinds. We will begin by talking about frequency histograms first. During the last lecture, we talked about the Titanic. This is a histogram for the age of passengers on Titanic. It's a graph. On the x-axis is the age of passengers. On the y-axis is the number of passengers in each age group. We can say that the graph shows the distributions of ages for Titanic passengers. When we say distribution, we mean the shape of the histogram. We can see the histogram is sort of shaped like a pyramid. Its height in the middle and lower at each point. In this class, whenever we make histograms of variables, we will often find a similar pattern. Most people have scores that fall toward the middle, and there are few people that have very high scores or very low scores. Now, I want to ask you some questions about this histogram. First, what group or sample is shown in this histogram? And what is the variable shown in this histogram? As you can see, the x-axis is divided into intervals. The first interval shows the number of passengers who were 0 to 10 years. The second interval is for passengers who were 10 to 20 years, and so on. So which age group have most passengers? The answer is between 20 and 30 years old. Yes, the most passenger fell in the age of group from 20 to 30. We can see that the x-axis of the graph here at the bottom marks in the interval as 20 to 30. The interval has two endpoints. The left endpoint is 20 years of age, and the right endpoint is 30 years of age. The interval includes all ages between those two numbers. Now, here is a question that is not meant to be tricky, but it might seem that way. Okay, so the question is, how many passengers on the Titanic were between 20 and 30 years old? Okay. So the correct answer is 350. Now, let me explain that answer. If we look over here at the y-axis, we can see that the height of the burr is 35 over the interval of 20 to 30. In some graphs, called the burr graphs, the height of a burr indicates how many people are represented by the burr. But the histograms are different. In a frequency histogram, the height of the burr indicates the number of people per unit of the variable on the x-axis. In this histogram, the variable on the x-axis is the age of passengers, and each unit is a year. So the height of the burr, which is 35, indicates the number of people per year. The interval from 20 to 30 is 10 years wide. So to find out how many passengers are represented by this burr, we need to multiply its height, 35 people per year, times its width, 10 years. As this slide shows, the number of passengers is 35 times 10. Let's do the math. The height of the burr is 35 passengers per unit. That is 35 passengers per year. The width of the burr is 10. To get the number, we just subtract the endpoints from each other. 30 minus 20 equal to 10. The area of the burr is height times width, which is 35 times 10, which equal to 350. So that's the area of the burr, 350. There were 350 passengers on the Titanic between the age of 20 to 30. In a Fleeken Sea histogram, the number of people represented by the bar is equal to the area of the bar. And the area of the bar is equal to its height times its width. Okay, so let's try it again. I'm going to ask you a question. Here is a question. How many passengers on Titanic were between 10 and 20 years old? Okay, so what's the answer? Okay, so the answer is around 150. So there were about 150 passengers between 10 and 20 years old. The height of the bird is about 15 per year. What is the width of the bird? So the bird is 10 units wide or 10 years wide. So the height of the bird is 15, the width is 10, and the area of the bird is height times width, which is 15 times 10 or 150. So this bird for the ages 10 to 20 represent 150 passengers. Next, I'm going to talk about a second kind of histogram that is called a density histogram. But before I do that, let's stop here and refresh our math knowledge. We are going to do a quick review for something you probably learned in 8th grade or high school, which is called proportions. A proportion is a part of a whole. It can be expressed as a fraction, a decimal, or a percentage. This slide shows a fraction, a decimal, and percentage. On the left is a fraction, 1/10. In the middle is a decimal, which we call 0.10. On the right is the percentage, 10%. Now the important thing to remember is that 1/10 is equal to 0.10 and to 10%. In other words, the fraction, the decimal, and the percentage all represent exactly the same proportion. 1/10 and 0.10 and 10% are just different ways of saying the same. Okay, so let's try another example. Here the fraction is a half. So what is the decimal that is equal to half? Okay, right, the fraction 1/2 is equal to the decimal point 0.50 or 15 hundredths. So what is the percentage that is equal to half and 0.50? Okay, so 50% is equal to a fraction of half and equal to the decimal 0.50. There are just different ways of expressing the same proportion. Okay, let's try another example. Here is a fraction 1/4. So what is the decimal that is equal to 1/4? Okay, so the right is the fraction 1/4 is equal to the decimal 0.25 or 25 hundredths. So what is the percentage that is equal to 1/4 and 0.25? Okay, so the answer is 25%. So 25% is equal to a fraction of 1/4 and equal to a decimal 0.25. Let's try another example. Here, instead of a fraction, we have a whole number 1. But we can write this number as decimal. Okay, so what the decimal is equal to 1? Right, so the whole number 1 is equal to the decimal 1.00. Okay, so what is the percentage that is equal to 1? Okay, so 100% is equal to 1. They both represent the same fraction. If you are still a little confused about the proportions or how to change fractions into decimals or percentages, then on the Blackboard you can find a PDF called Basic Math Review for Psych 1303 Statistical Methods. The review has a short section that explains about proportions and shows how to change fractions into decimals or percentages. This PDF also covers some other basic math that you will need for this class. Okay, so check out the review if you think you might need a refresher. Alright, so now we've reviewed the topic of proportions. So we are ready to talk about the second kind of histograms. They are called density histogram. This is a density histogram. Before we talk about what's different about this kind of histogram, let's talk about how it's the same as frequency histogram we looked at a few minutes ago. First, what is the group whose scores are shown in this density histogram? Second, what is the variable that the histogram is about? Okay, so it is age of passengers, and notice that the variable is shown on the x-axis at the bottom, divided into the same intervals as for the frequency histograms we were looking at before. Passengers who were less than 10 years old is the first, and the passengers who were 10 or older but less than 20 are the second one. Okay, and so on. Alright, so now let's look at the distribution. Does the shape of the density histogram look the same as the shape of the frequency histogram? Yes, the distributions look exactly the same for the density histogram as for the frequency histogram. We have the same pyramid shape, with most people bunching up around the middle. Okay, but now we come to the one big difference between this density histogram and the frequency histogram we looked at before. Here on the left, on the y-axis, it says the height of the birds indicate percent of passengers per year. On the frequency histogram we looked at before, what did the height of the bird indicate? Okay, so on the frequency histogram, the y-axis indicated the number of passengers, which also called the frequency passengers. Here I will show you. This is one of the slides I showed you for frequency histogram, and the y-axis indicated the number of passengers per year. And for the comparison, here is the density histogram again. The density histogram has the percent per year on the y-axis, not the number of per year. Okay, so now we are looking at the density histogram with the percentage on the y-axis. Now you are ready for a tough question. It's not a tricky question, just a tough question. So the question is, what the percentage of Titanic passengers were between ages 30 and 40? Right? The correct answer is that about 20% of passengers were ages 30 to 40. Here's how we can tell. Okay, if we look at the y-axis, we see the numbers of passengers falling in this age group is about 2% per year. But how many years are there in the interval? So there are 10 years in the interval with 2% per year. So what percent of the passengers are in the interval? Okay, so that is right, 20%. The years are the units for the histogram. There are 10 units in the interval for passengers who were 30 to 40 years, with 2% per unit. So 20% of the passengers were 30 to 40 years old. Okay, so there is another question. What percent of the Titanic passengers were between ages 10 and 20? Okay, so in this histogram, if we want to know what percentage fall into an interval, you multiply the percentage per year times the number of years in the interval. So in this case, the percent per year is about 1.5%, and the number of years is 10. So you multiply 1.5% times 10 and get the 15%. So this is the way with density histograms. First, in a density histogram, the height of the burr tells us the density of the burr. Density is the percentage of individual per unit. Over here on the left of the graph, we can see what the unit is. The unit is 1 year. So the height of the bird in this graph tells us what percentage of the passengers there were for 1 year. Our unit is 1 year. Second, in a density histogram, the area of the bird tells us the total percentage of individuals represented by the bird. We get the area of the bird by multiplying the width of the bird, in this case 10 years, times the height of the bird, which is its density. And this area tells us the percentage of people represented by the bird. So two big things to remember about the density histogram. First, height of the bird indicates density. And second, area of a bird indicates the total percentage of individuals represented by the bird. Here is the third big thing to remember a density histogram. What is the area of the entire density histogram? Okay, so if the bird equal to 7% of the individual and the next bird represents 15% of individuals and the next one represent about 34% of individual and so on, when we add up all the birds, then they must equal 100% of individuals. So the total area of the birds, a density histogram is always 1, which is the same as saying it is always 100%. Always. So you want to get it clear in your mind. There are two kinds of histograms, frequency histograms and density histograms. If a frequency histogram and a density histogram both represent the same data, like for the ages of Titanic passengers, then the shape of the two histograms will usually look exactly the same. In a frequency histogram, the height of a bird indicates number per unit, and the area of a bird indicates the number of people represented by the bird. In a density histogram, the height of a bird indicates density or percent per unit, and the area of a bird indicates percent of people represented by the bird. And remember, the total area of a density histogram is always 100%. Okay, so now we are going to do a class exercise. Okay, make sure you download a handout which is called the Constructing a Density Histogram exercise for class 2 of Psych 1303 Statistical Methods. Alright, so now today we will be working on together, and okay, so let's see how it goes. Alright, so I am now going to show you how to construct a density histogram. Our group or sample is the 50 states of the United States. Each state has one or more seats in Congress, congresswomen or congressmen who represent the voters in Washington. The variable we will be using is the number of congressional seats for each state. Okay, so now on the sheets I have handed out to you, there is a frequency table with some information about how many representatives there are from the different states. So take a look at the frequency table. As you can see, the table contains some numbers, but there are other numbers we will have to fill out. As you can see, the table has many spaces where numbers can be written. These spaces are called cells. We are going to fill in the empty cells together. Okay, so here is on the slide. Some of the cells on the first line of the table are highlighted. This row tells us that there are 15 states that have 0 to 3 seats in the United States House of Representatives. The third column, which is headed Frequency Number of States, tells us the number of states in this row. The number of states is 15. This column on the far left tells us the number of congressional representatives, or what is called the number of seats. In this first row, the number of congressional seats is 0 to 3. So this first row is telling us there are 15 states that have 0 to 3 congressional states. The number of seats is the variable we are interested in, and we see that there is an interval 0 to 3. The left endpoint of the interval is 0. The right endpoint of the interval is 3. So now let's fill in this cell. We want to write in the width of the interval. So what is the width of the interval 0 to 3 in units? Right? So this interval is 3 units wide. If we subtract the left endpoint from the right endpoint, we get 3. 3 is the number of units between the left and right endpoints. So we will write 3 into this cell. Let's try this row that is highlighted. The numbers tell us there are 5 states with 10 to 15 congressional seats. What's the width of this interval? Okay, the width of this interval is 5 units because 15 minus 10 is 5. So we will write in 5 here. Okay, so now you get the idea. So please go ahead and fill in the empty cells for width of interval. Okay. Here are the numbers for the width of interval. Next, we are going to fill in the numbers in this column. Its heading says percent in interval. In this table, that means percent of states in this interval. The table tells us the numbers of states in this interval, which is 15. To calculate the percent, we first need to know the total number of states in this column. So we just add all numbers in this column to get the total. 15 plus 23 plus 5 plus 3 plus 3 plus 1. What the total do we get? Okay, so we get 50. The total number of states is 50. We already know there are 50 states in the United States of America. So it's a good sign that our math gave us the same number. So now we go back to our problem. The total number of states is 50. The number of states in this interval is 15. So the percentage of the states in this interval is 15 divided by 50. 15 divided by 50 is 30%. So the percentage of states in this interval is 30%. Right? So let's try it again with this row. In this row, the number of states is 5. So what is the percent of states in this interval? The percentage of states in this interval is 5 divided by 50, which is 10%. Any questions about how we get this number? Okay. If so, please make sure you go back and review what we did. Okay, so now please fill in all empty cells in this column. It should take about 2 minutes. Okay. Alright, so here are the numbers. Okay, so now to check your work and add up all these percentages. The total of percentages should be 100%. We are just checking this, our numbers are correct. Now let's fill in this column. We will start with this cell. We need to find out the density for this interval. Remember, density is the percentage per unit. Here's how we calculate it. Okay, so we know that the 30% of the states are in this interval, and we also know that this interval is 3 units wide. So the percent of states in the interval is 30%. The number of units in the interval is 3. In another word, the interval is 3 units wide. Now we can do our calculations. The density is equal to percent per unit. So the density is equal to 30% divided by 3. That means the density is 10% because 30% divided by 3 is 10%. So we write the number 10% in the cell. Let's try it again with this cell. Okay, to calculate the density, we divide the percent in the interval by the width of the interval. That is, we divide 46% by 7. What the density do we get? Okay, so the density is 6.6% because 46% divided by 7 is 6.6%. Right, so go ahead and fill in the rest of the cells in this column. Okay, so here are the densities. Now we already got on to the second step. We will use our frequency table to construct a density histogram. Now we are ready to go on to the second step. We will use our frequency table to construct a density histogram. Okay. So now we are going to construct the histogram. We will begin with the x-axis. The first thing we do is draw the x-axis. Okay, here we go. So that wasn't too hard because the x-axis is just a horizontal line. And go ahead and draw the x-axis on your worksheet. Next, we will write the variable names under the x-axis. The name of variable is number of sheets in Congress. Go ahead and write that on your worksheet. Okay, so next, we are going to write the scale on the axis. The scale is the numbers that are written along the axis. Okay, we write 0 at the left end of the x-axis and the 60 at the right hand. Now, why did we choose 0 and 60? Let's look back at the frequency table. The table shows that the lowest value of the variable is 0 and the highest value of the variable is 60. So 0 and 60 are good numbers for the end of our x-axis. And now we just fill in some numbers between 0 and 60 on the x-axis. So go ahead and add them to your worksheet. Okay, now you might want to add some little tick marks along the line. Now we are ready for the y-axis. First draw the y-axis. So I'm about to add the y-axis. So there it is. Go ahead and add it to your worksheets. Next, we are going to write density besides the axis. Okay, so that is the label for the y-axis. Go ahead and write the density beside the y-axis on your worksheet. Now that we have labeled the y-axis, we are going to mark the scale on that axis. So as you can see, we have marked 10% at the top and 0 is up at the bottom. And we have marked 5% and some other percentage between 0 and 10. Now, in case you are wondering why we chose 10%, let's look back at the frequency table. The table shows that the highest density is 10%. So we make the top of the y-axis at least 10%. We want the y-axis to be tall enough when we draw the birds with a density of 10%. Alright, so now we have the x-axis and y-axis ready. So we are going to make the endpoints of the intervals on x-axis. This column shows the intervals and their endpoints. The endpoints are 0, 3, 10, 15, 20, and so on. We are going to make little marks on the x-axis so we know where these endpoints are. You can see how I have written 0, 3, 10, 15, 20, and so on along the x-axis at the appropriate points. Go ahead and do the same work on your worksheets. Next, we are going to draw a burr above each interval. The height of a burr will be equal to density of that interval. So the first interval is from 0 to 3, and the density, that is the height of the burr, is 10. So here are our axes. And now we are going to add the burr over the interval 0 to 3. Here is the burr, and notice that its height is 10%, which is the density for the interval. Let's try it again. For the interval 3 to 10, the density is 6.6%. So 6.6% is the height of the burr for this interval. So now we will draw the burr over the interval 3 to 10. Here is the burr. Its height is 6.6%. Okay, so your histogram should look like this now. These burrs at the right are much shorter than the burrs at the left. Now we will write the density above each burr. Okay, here I have written in 10% above the first burr and 6.6% above the second burr. The heights and the density are the same. So go ahead and write the densities above all the burrs on your worksheets. Okay, so this shows all the densities written in. Okay, so we have finished drawing the histogram. Alright, so now let's see how this histogram can be used to answer some questions. Here is the first question. What percent of states have 0 to 3 seats in Congress? Alright, so the correct answer is 30% of the states have 0 to 3 seats in Congress. Would you please explain how you arrived at this answer? Okay? So the explanation is the width of the bird is 3 units, the height is 10%, so the area of the bird is 30%. Okay, so what percent of states have 3 to 10 seats? Right, it's about 46% of states have 3 to 10 seats. The width of the bird is 7, that is 10 minus 3. The height is 6.6%. When we multiply those together, we get about 46%. Now I'm about to ask a question that can be answered in two ways. So here is a question. What percent of states have between 10 and 60 seats in Congress? Okay, the correct answer is 24% of states have between 10 and 60 seats. Okay, so there are two ways to answer this question. One way is add up the area of all four of these birds. Okay, so add the first bird and another bird and another bird. Okay, and that will give you 2%. But here is the quick way. We already figured out the first bird on the left is 30%, and the bird next is 46%. That's 76 of states have 1 to 10 representatives. The area of the whole histogram is 100%. If we want to know what percent of states have 10 to 60 representatives, we subtract 76% from 100%. 100% minus 76% is 24%. So that gives us our answer quickly. The secret is remembering the total area of the histogram is 100%. Okay, so let's review what we just learned. So there are two kinds of histograms, frequency histograms and density histograms. If we are using them to represent the same data, for example, today we use them to represent the ages of Titanic passengers, the two histograms will look almost identical. However, there are important differences between them. In a frequency histogram, the height of each bird represents the number of individuals per unit. In a density histogram, the height of each bird represents the density, which means the percent of individuals per unit. In a density histogram, the area of each bird represents the percent of the individuals that fall into the interval represented by the bird. If we want to know how many individuals fall into an interval, we multiply the height of the bird, which is density, times the width of the bird, the number of units. In a density histogram, the total area of all the birds added together is always 100%. Now, we are going to talk about something called the nominal distribution and how it is related to density histograms. Okay, so this is from a study that compared the heights of 200 husbands and 200 wives. This is a density histogram of the husband of heights in millimeters. What is a good estimate of the average height of the husbands? In statistics, we often call the average the mean. The mean is around 1,725 millimeters. Notice that this histogram has the pyramid shape we have seen before. The birds are higher in the middle. That tells us that most husbands had heights close to the mean. The birds are shorter at the right end of the histogram, so that means the very few husbands were a lot taller than the average. The birds at the left end of the histogram are also short. So what does that tell us? So It tells us that the very few husbands were a lot shorter than the average. So now I'm going to draw the normal distribution on the slide. So we can compare it with this histogram. Okay, so here's the normal distribution, also called the normal curve. As you can see, the normal curve is shaped like a bell. In fact, it's sometimes called the bell curve. And you can see that its shape is similar to the pyramid formed by the histogram. The normal distribution and the pyramid are both tall in the center and lower at each end. Furthermore, the normal curve is symmetric. That is, the right side is like a mirror image of the left side. The left and right sides are exactly the same except that they are reversed. The normal curve is what is called a theoretical distribution. It's theoretical because it provides us with an identical picture of something. The normal curve gives an ideal picture of the histogram. And as we will learn in this class, it can help us to solve the real-world problems involving histograms and distributions. Here's another density histogram from the same study of the husband and wives. This density histogram shows the distribution of height for the wives. What is a good estimate of the wife's mean height? Okay, the answer is around 1600 millimeters. On average, how does the height of the wives compare with the height of their husbands? Are the wives shorter, taller, or about the same height as their husband? Okay, so the answer is wives are shorter. So here's a normal curve drawn in. As you can see, it fits pretty closely to the shape of the histogram. In general, it is true that the heights for people of the same age, gender, and nationality tend to be normally distributed, or at least close to the normal distributed. Okay, so this is an interesting slide. It shows the speed of horses who won the Kentucky Derbies between 1960 and the year 2000. The Kentucky Derby is a famous horse race. So what was the average speed of the horses who won the Kentucky Derby? The graph shows the 54 miles per hour. So according to this histogram, the average speed of the horses who won the Kentucky Derby was 54 miles per hour. Now, an interesting thing about these speeds is that they show the familiar pyramid shape. The birds are higher here in the middle, which indicates the most winning horses had the speeds that were close to the average for winners. Here on the right, we can see the really fast horses, but there are not many of them. And on the left side are the smaller number of horses who were a bit slower but still won. Okay? So by the way, sometimes there is a raining day and of the Kentucky Derby and the racetrack is muddy. So maybe this is why some of the winners have slower times because they had to run on mud instead of a hard track. So now looking at this histogram, do you think it's closer to a normal curve? As you can see, the histogram for winning speed is pretty close to a normal curve. That's the one of amazing things about the normal curve. A lot of important variables are normally distributed or at least close to it. There are deep reasons why the normal curve keeps cropping up, but I'm not going to go into these today. Here's another example. There are IQ scores for 5,000 10-year-old children. As you can see, the mean IQ is 100. That's good. because the average IQ is supposed to be 100. As you can see, the birds are the highest in the middle, indicating most children have IQ scores close to 100. Over on the right are the lily black kids. There are not many of them. And on the left are children who are intelligently challenged. As you can see, the distribution of the IQ scores is really normal. As I've said, the normal curve shows up in a lot of places. So to summarize, the normal distribution is a theoretical distribution that closely resembles many density histograms. It's highly useful, and we will be using it again and again in this course. Sometimes we will use the normal distribution in place of density histogram. So in this histogram, instead of showing the birds, we can just show the normal curve. Like this. When you see a normal curve like this, you can treat it just like a density histogram. The high part in the middle of the curve represents the large number of children with IQs close to average. The right and left ends of the curve represent the children with very high or very low IQs, and these extreme parts of the curve are not very high because they are very few children at the extremes. Now, what is the area under the normal curve? Remember that the normal distribution is basically a density histogram. It's an ideal histogram, a smoothed out histogram, and the area under the curve is 100%. Or, if we are using a decimal, we can say the area under the normal curve is always 1. Furthermore, just like in a density histogram, the area under any interval of the curve equals the number of individuals in that interval. So what percent of children fall under this normal curve? The correct answer is 100%. Okay, now I've colored in the parts of this graph that represent children with IQs of 100 or higher. You could think of this as the words on the histogram. So what is the area of this part of the graph that I've colored red? The total area under the curve is 100%. The area that is colored in is half of that, so its area must be 50%. So now, what percent of children have IQs of 100 or higher? Okay, so just remember, the area under any interval of the curve represents the proportion of individuals who fall into the interval. So if the interval reaches to 100, like the far right end of the curve, the area under the interval of the curve is 50%. And that means that 50% of children fall in this interval. Alright, so today we learned about frequency histograms and density histogram. We also learned about the normal curve, which we can think of a kind of histogram. Even though the normal distribution is a theoretical distribution, it works very well to describe many different variables.